This video was made possible with the help of Dr. Sam Willis of the Society for Nautical Research, who runs the Mariner's Mirror podcast, which you can find on its own YouTube channel, link in the video description below, and also on the Society for Nautical Research's website. So many thanks to Dr. Willis, both for his assistance in the rather wonderful animation that you'll see later in the video, and also on some of the material that he's done on the K-Class, as well as, of course, the other sources we consulted. But let's get on with the K-Class themselves, shall we? Ah, yes, the infamous K-Class. You had to cover them some point, Drac. Well, here you go. The K-Class submarines had their origins actually in a rather interesting concept that arose just before World War I and would recur frequently over the next few decades, even if that aim was never quite realised. Namely, the fleet submarine, a vessel that was fast enough on the surface to keep up with the main fleet formation of battleships, before then submerging to deal out unseen torpedo attacks to an enemy fleet in the midst of battle. Even the much-famed Gato class was both an attempt at this concept and something of a failure in that regard, since by the time they entered service a good portion of the 21-knot US battle line was out of action and the newer battleships were considerably faster. But, for the Gatos at least, the capabilities that the attempt granted them made them exceptionally good commerce raiders. But back in 1913, Britain had a surprisingly large fleet of submarines, considering pop culture history seems to talk about the Germans with subs, but it was also suffering from early adopter syndrome, as most of its subs were only really suitable for short-range coastal missions and could not serve overseas, unless somebody towed them to a literal theatre elsewhere and then let them loose, assuming that the sub survived the trip. And so, in 1913, Admiral Keyes asked two shipyards, Vickers of Sheffield and Scott's of Greenock, to come up with designs for a large submarine. Initially, these were for an overseas design, which was wholly British, as a number of foreign designs had recently been procured, but it was fairly clear that a native design capability for a submarine capable of operating at long distances in the oceans was needed. Vickers came back with what was for the time a monster sub. The largest submarine then in British service or under construction was the E-Class, which tipped the scales at just over 660 tons on the surface. The new submarine was proposed at well over twice that, at around 1,450 tons when on the surface, and with an operational range of 5,300 miles. This actually put it in the size range of the Tambor class of the late 1930s United States Navy, which was the immediate predecessor class, in terms of continuity of design, to the Gatos. And it actually made this Vickers proposal larger than any Type 7 U-boat variant of World War II, and larger than all but one of the Type 9 variants in the Kriegsmarine of World War II. Scott's design was a little bit smaller, at merely 932 tons, but that was still 50% larger than anything in the Royal Navy inventory to date. But there was a big difference between the two designs that wasn't anything related to their size. Whereas the E-Class used a pair of 800 brake horsepower diesel engines, the two-shaft Vickers design required no less than 3,700 brake horsepower, or about 1,850 brake horsepower per engine, which those of you who can do a quick bit of maths will realise is 250 more brake horsepower per engine than the combined power output of an E-Class. Ostensibly, this would give the craft a surface speed of about 20 knots, assuming that everything worked. But this ambition was somewhat offset by Scott's proposal. Now, they had a license to build Fiat diesel engines, since no British design was up to the power output that even their smaller sub needed to reach 20 knots, realistically speaking. But even then, Scots were hesitant about putting a guarantee on the reliability of even the better Fiat license-built engines. Instead, they suggested that the sub should use steam turbines. Keyes, who was already somewhat wary of Vickers' promises that honestly these hilariously powerful almost 2,000 brake horsepower diesels would work, decided that it was best to order one boat of each design to see how they compared with each other in service. The Vickers craft would become HMS Nautilus, which was almost 260 foot long and fitted with 8 torpedo tubes, 2 in the bow, 2 in the stern, and 4 on the beam, with a single reload provided for each tube. She featured a double hull for her ballast tanks instead of the, at the time, far more common saddle tanks, and the Scots craft became HMS Swordfish. She didn't have stern tubes, but otherwise the armament layout was similar to Nautilus, save that the bow tubes were 21 inches in diameter, whilst the beam tubes were the smaller 18-inch tubes, compared to Nautilus, which had an all 18-inch fit-out. Swordfish was somewhat based on an Italian design that Scots had access to, but whilst her steam plant was kept secret, just in case it actually happened to prove to be an innovation, Lord Fisher, who at the time was yet to return to the Admiralty, although he would soon do so and become Admiral Fisher again, was not particularly impressed. He wrote in June 1913, "The oil engine, i.e. diesel and heavy oil fuel engines, will govern all sea fighting, and all sea fighting is going to be governed by submarines, and yet, like damned fools, we are only spending as much money on them as the Germans, and we are behind them in the oil engine. And so, like the French, we are fatally hankering after steam engines in submarines." This is actually another reference to the fact that pre-war, the German U-boat budget actually wasn't that large. But whilst these two designs, Nautilus and Swordfish, were being refined into something that could actually be built, the Director of Naval Construction came up with his own idea, which was for a submarine 338 foot long with an even greater 1,700-ton displacement when surfaced, which was considerably larger than most destroyers of the time. It was equipped with steam turbines and would reach 24 knots on the surface and carry 8 21-inch torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow and 4 on the beam. Its somewhat shorter range of only 3,000 miles betrayed a shift over towards the idea of supporting the fleet, which this design theoretically could actually do quite well, because it could range ahead of the fleet at 24 knots when the fleet was only capable of a maximum of 21. But the great size of the sub compared to existing designs, coupled with its novel power plant, and what that size might do to the sub's ability to control its depth, which turned out to be something of a prescient concern, meant that the design was put on hold until Nautilus and Swordfish, which had already been ordered, could be evaluated. You then got the return of Fisher and the outbreak of war in 1914, which meant that some time passed before the idea of a large fleet submarine was revisited, as Fisher ordered a fleet of new submarines, but they were all based on the proven E-class, as this allowed them to boost numbers very quickly, and it was known that the E-class didn't have any particularly finicky handling characteristics. But towards the end of 1914, rumours began to circulate based on some somewhat sketchy intel before the war that suggested the Germans might have been planning a class of high-speed submarine of their own, and now these somewhat dodgy intel reports seemed to suggest that this was true. The pre-dreadnought HMS Formidable was lost to a U-boat attack on the first day of 1915, and the survivors swore blind that the submarine that had torpedoed her had kept pace with the old battleship in the midst of a gale, whilst said battleship was churning along at full speed. This was not something that any existing British sub would have been capable of. Fisher, reacting to this, demanded a new submarine design immediately. He wanted the submarine to hit 20 knots on the surface. The Director of Naval Construction pointed out that even though Nautilus was on paper supposed to be capable of this, she wasn't yet in service, and there was considerable doubt about what top speed she would actually manage. Spoiler alert, in fact, she'd only managed to get up to 17 knots in her trials, but they didn't know that at the time. The fastest any submarine that was actually in service under the White Ensign could do at that point was a touch over 15 knots. But steam engines, as opposed to a diesel power plant, could manage to get the speed that Fisher wanted. But Fisher was adamant there would be no steam engines on his watch, at least in subs. In December 1914, the French submarine Archimede, a small steam-powered vessel, had joined the British subs that were trying to torpedo Hipper's battlecruisers who were on their way back from bombarding Scarborough and Hartlepool. Archimede was struck by heavy seas that bent over her funnel so badly that it couldn't be lowered, and since it couldn't be lowered, the hatch that kept the area watertight when she was submerged couldn't be closed, and thus she was stuck on the surface with limited steam power thanks to the crimping effect of the bent funnel, and with water pouring in through the now warped seal. The crew ended up having to form a bucket brigade to keep the engine room vaguely dry, and the sub slowly limped home. This, Fisher insisted, was one of the many reasons he did not want anything to do with steam engines on submarines. The Director of Naval Construction accordingly went back to the drawing board and came up with another option. Instead of aiming for the moon with over 1800 brake horsepower per shaft on a two-shaft design like the Vickers sub, he put no less than 3 shafts on a 1200-ton sub with a 1200 brake horsepower engine attached each. These engines were simply extended versions of the Vickers diesels that could be found on the D and E class, as Vickers reckoned they could get about 100 brake horsepower out of a single cylinder, and the D-class engines had thus had 6 cylinders for 600 brake horsepower, the E-class had 8 cylinders for 800 brake horsepower, and so Vickers reasoned if they made a 12-cylinder version they could get 1200 brake horsepower. The Director of Naval Construction thought this might enable the sub to reach 21 knots or so, and thus 8 J-class submarines were ordered, since it was hoped that this speed, which was exactly the current speed of the British battle line, might also allow them to tick the box for a submarine that could support the battle fleet. This battle fleet support sub was still a feature in high demand amongst the senior officers of the fleet, despite some early war efforts to carry this out using slower subs, leading to 3 cases of the submarines thinking the British ships they were travelling with were hostile, which resulted in the near torpedoing of the cruiser Lowestoft by its own side, and several attempted rammings by cruisers who thought that the friendly submarines travelling with them were in fact U-boats. Keyes, at this point, stopped being in charge of the Royal Navy submarines and was sent over to the Dardanelles, and Commodore Hall took over the position. He was also a proponent of the fleet submarine idea, but one of his first jobs was to tell Fisher that the J-class probably would only reach 19 knots, which was 2 knots slower than the fleet's combat speed. And Vickers had also indicated that anything more than 12 cylinders per engine was beyond them for the moment. With Nautilus now looking like it was going to fall short of speed as well, as we mentioned earlier they'd only ever managed 17 knots, even Vickers had gone to suggesting steam engines if Fisher really wanted a 21-knot sub or faster. The Director of Naval Construction dusted off his design from 1913, combined in a few good ideas from the latest Vickers steam-powered proposal, and pointed out that this revised version of his design couldn't suffer from the same fate as Archimedes due to differences in the funnel and vent designs. Seeming to have no other option, Fisher gave in, although he insisted that a small diesel engine be included to allow the submarine to move immediately under internal combustion engine power when it surfaced, before the boiler was brought up to speed, and would also allow the steam engines to be doused early if they needed to dive, which would accelerate dive time since in theory they could run for a short time on the diesel on the surface as well. A few other changes were also included. Since the residual heat in the boiler room, once the boiler fires had been put out, made the chamber completely unlivable for a while after the submarine had dived and the vents had been closed, the plan had been to simply isolate the boiler room until it cooled down, with obviously the sea on all sides acting as a heat sink. But this effectively cut the submarine in half for the crew, as the turbine room, the diesel and most of the batteries, and pretty much most of the crew quarters, to say the least, were all at the back, and the command centre, the forward torpedo room, the abeam torpedo rooms, and a number of other functions were all ahead of this area. And so a small insulated side passage was added that went past the boiler room. A third deck gun was also added to the design, and the 21-inch torpedo tubes were changed to 18-inch tubes, as the 18-inch tube was already being made in large numbers, and it was thought that this would help accelerate construction, as opposed to speeding up the rather limited number of 21-inch submarine torpedo tubes that were being built at the time. To compensate for this slight reduction in firepower, the 4 bow and 4 beam tubes were supplemented by placing 2 single deck-mounted torpedo launchers near the funnel, which would give the submarine additional firepower at least when surfaced. Each internal tube carried a single reload, so there were a total of 18 torpedoes carried. 4 submarines to this new design were ordered first from Vickers, then another 2 from Portsmouth, then Fisher resigned over the Dardanelles campaign, and then 10 more were ordered shortly after he left from a number of dockyards. A number of other orders would follow, and we'll cover all of them briefly a little bit later. The Director of Naval Construction went off and happily began drafting an even larger 30-knot submarine. But news from HMS Swordfish, which was by this point on trials, was not great, so the board gently pushed back on this new design until a bit more was known about the performance of steam-driven submarines. In fact, even Commodore Hall was having his doubts, writing to the Third Sea Lord, "The K-class must be considered a very bold advance in submarine design, being an increase over 300% on anything previously tried. It is not yet certain that high speed will always carry tactical advantage. Generally speaking, in submarines, the power to submerge takes the place of high speed. A high-speed submarine will have many disadvantages. Her length makes her a great target for torpedo attack. Her visibility makes her easier to stalk by hostile submarines. It is true that high speed enables her to zigzag and thus renders her more difficult to hit, but the balance is considered to leave her with disadvantage. Underwater, she is made unhandy to maneuver quickly for a torpedo attack, and she requires deep water to work in. She's more likely to strike mines, both on the surface and submerged. She's also much more costly and a much greater anxiety to the personnel. Only the necessity of accompanying the battle fleet justified, in my opinion, the size of the K-class." But, on paper at least, the idea was sound. The K-class would be easily able to keep pace with the fleet, and then, at the report of the enemy fleet's location, they could proceed at a speed that was almost as good as a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship to a position ahead of the enemy. They could then submerge and await the chance to unleash a devastating torpedo volley. They might even be able to flat-out chase down an enemy fleet at night, since their high speed and low observability seem to suggest that stealth attacks on the surface might well be possible. In August 1916, HMS K3 was the first of the class to be commissioned. But this is where reality met theory. The first trials the submarine ran were surface speed trials. She did indeed manage 24 knots. But the temperature in the boiler room and the turbine rooms climbed and kept climbing. The hatches were all opened, but still the heat built, until the engineers were forced to flee to the submarine's upper deck, poking into the furnace below occasionally with a stick until some brave souls doused themselves in the spray that the sub was throwing up, which gave them just enough time to head down and start to reduce the power and thus the speed as well as the generated heat. Travelling at a more sedate pace, the submarine then ran into a high sea, which smashed all the windows in the upper part of the conning tower, and then a British armed trawler on patrol saw a very large submarine of unknown design sailing toward itself at high speed and promptly opened fire. K3 managed to evade the shots, which largely fell short, and thinking better of the whole situation, decided to turn around and go home. A few changes were made as a result of this, especially to the level of heat insulation and the power of the ventilation fans in the machinery spaces, and at the end of 1916 the submarine was scheduled for diving trials, with no less a person than Prince Albert, the future King George VI, and a serving naval officer who had already seen action aboard a turret aboard HMS Collingwood at the Battle of Jutland, present, when the submarine began to slip beneath the waves. The Prince decided to head aft to see the electrical motor controls, when suddenly the bow dropped like a stone and the submarine dived at such a steep angle that many men were thrown off their feet and into bulkheads that had suddenly become the floor. The Prince and his escort grabbed on to various handholds and managed to ride out the dive until K3 ploughed straight into the bottom, bow first. The water was only 150 foot deep, and K3 was 339 foot long. This circle was squared as her stern reared out of the water, propellers still spinning, and once everyone had picked themselves up, it took about 20 minutes to figure out how to get the stern back into the water to allow the propellers to bite, and thus reverse the sub out of the seabed, then blow the ballast tanks to surface the whole submarine. It was a lucky escape. Having then scraped the mud and rocks out of the bow tubes, K3 headed for Scapa Flow and joined the Grand Fleet. But things proved to be quite difficult here as well. On January the 9th, 1917, she was steaming along when a port beam sea sent water cascading down the funnels, albeit they didn't bend, so at least that was correct. The water cascade put out the boilers. Losing power, the sub was then rolled beam on onto the sea, with each wave bringing in yet more water. The boiler room was over half full of water by the time the funnels were lowered and sealed, the sub's great size managing to keep it afloat despite having over 100 tons of water now aboard. Fisher's foresight proved invaluable, though. The diesel engine that he'd insisted on fitting, which was the same power as one of the power plants on an E-class sub, was brought back to life, and K3 was able to move on its power, heading for a safe harbour, whilst the diesel also drove the pumps, which tried to get some of the water back where it belonged, outside of the sub. K2, 4, 6 and 13 were undergoing acceptance trials at around this time, and K13's trials seemed to be going well, with only minor and easily fixable issues noted when she prepared for her final test dive in Garaloch. The funnels tucked themselves away on electric motors, and hatches on both the superstructure and the pressure hull closed to seal the resulting holes in those hulls, the latter also being sealed by hand from within. Most of the ballast tanks were flooded, and the submarine began to dive. A warning light was flickering on one of the boiler room ventilation monitors, but the officers were assured that the circuit had just been wired wrong, and so the last ballast tanks were flooded and the hydroplane set to a down angle. Luckily, an engineer went to check the boiler room, which was cool by now as the sub had been proceeding on diesel and electrical power for a little while, and he saw a cascade of water pouring into the boiler room from one of the ventilator shafts. The watertight doors were rapidly slammed shut, but somehow the water continued to spread. The submarine was only 10 foot under when the order was given to put the hydroplanes to the full rise position and to start blowing the ballast tanks, but the sub kept dropping. In moments, all watertight doors were ordered shut, not just the ones in the boiler room. The 10-ton keel up forward was ordered dropped. This was an emergency measure designed to lighten the sub. All forward ballast tanks were blown, but still the submarine continued to sink. At 50 foot down, the sub finally stopped diving, but only because she'd reached the bottom of Garaloch. Water then started venting through the voice tubes, shorting out the electrical boards and starting fires that prevented access to the valves that would stem the flow of water. Eventually, sacking was used to plug the tubes, and after a number of injuries, some minor and some severe, the electrical switchboard had its fires put out, but only after smoke had filled the air and fire had burned through much of the precious oxygen. Even in sealed portions of the submarine, the bulkheads were beginning to leak. As it turned out, the seals on the pipes and wires that passed through them happened to have been rated for 15 psi, but with everything from the boiler room aft seemingly flooded, they were being subjected at a 50-foot depth to at least 25 psi. The aft ballast tanks and the aft droppable keel were controlled from the engine room, and it seemed likely, and indeed this was the case, everyone there was dead. The crew did try and raise the brand new submarine E-50, which was also on trials, via an early underwater sound-powered telephone, but the device wasn't working. The captain then did a roll call. 49 men answered, 31 did not. A naval architect for the trials calculated that, based on his knowledge of human anatomy and his knowledge of the interior volume of the sub, they had about 15 hours of air left if they waited for rescue, whereas if they worked to try and fix the boat, which was obviously a more energetic activity, they had about 8 hours of air left. Luckily, the commander of E-50 was good friends with Lieutenant Commander Godfrey Herbert, who was in charge of K-13, and when K-13 failed to surface, E-50 headed over to investigate. Although the initial signs, a little bit of oil and a few air bubbles, seemed somewhat perplexing. Below, some of the survivors were expert workers from the dockyard, and rewiring and rebuilding was taking place to try and restore as many of the subsystems as possible, and to stay ahead of the various short circuits as water continued to infiltrate the sub. Several rescue ships gathered alongside E-50, but in an attempt to dive down to find out what happened to the sub failed when the diving suit, which had rotted from years of unuse, fell apart on entering the water and nearly drowned the diver. Another diving suit was sent for from the shore, and a tapped Morse code was exchanged. But shortly after this message was exchanged, further messages tapped out from the sub became unreadable. The levels of oxygen in the sub were falling, and the build-up of carbon dioxide and other gases was rising too quickly, and finer language skills like how to hammer out Morse code seemed to have been one of the first things to go. Having earlier pumped some air from the sub into the various air bottles to reduce the overpressure that was being caused by the flooding, the crew now swapped this contained relatively fresh air with the stilted air of the submarine to try and eke out a little bit more time. At this stage, however, dawn had risen the next day, and they were rapidly coming to the end of the calculated 15 hours of air they had left. Realizing that the vessels on the surface might not realize their predicament and try and raise the sub entirely rather than fix air lines to the valves that were on the outside of the hull for the purpose, which would thus delay the access of fresh air to the sub and doom them all, Lieutenant Commander Goodhart, who was the captain of K-14 and had come along for the ride, was asked to risk leaving the sub via the conning tower to tell the people above this particular set of news. Lieutenant Commander Herbert joined him in the conning tower, with the idea being to seal it from the rest of the sub, and then flood it, save for the small dome forward. With the pressure between the outside and within the conning tower now roughly equalised, Goodhart would open the upper hatch in the conning tower, work his way through the chart house above and out into open water. Herbert would then close the hatch and knock on the conning tower floor, signalling the men below to drain the conning tower so that he could rejoin them. After some jury rigging to enable all this, the attempt was made, with a watertight tin containing farewell letters and a message telling the rescue ships what to do going with them. Goodhart was told to release this tin, which was wrapped in red bunting for extra visibility, the instant he was clear of the sub, just in case something happened to him on the ascent. Part of the jury rigging included a blast of high-pressure air which was to be released at the same time as the hatch was opened to speed him on his way and to equalise the last bit of pressure that might otherwise impede his opening of the hatch. As it turned out, this blast worked a bit too well, catapulting Goodhart through the chart house like a human ICBM, but also sweeping Herbert off of his feet in the conning tower and chucking him through the chart house and out into open water. Up above, after some argument between the various salvage ships about the best way to go about things, the rescue ships were in the process of trying to drag a wire underneath the bow of the sub in an effort to raise it to the surface and extract the crew via the torpedo tubes, when a burst of air on the surface brought a man to the surface. It was Herbert. Goodhart was nowhere to be seen. Rapidly informing the rescue ships of the situation, Herbert ensured that divers tried to connect E-50's powerful air pumps to K-13, but for some reason the divers could not find the external connections that should have been present. The air inside ran lower still. Most men were unable to move, and their pulses and breaths skyrocketed as their bodies searched for oxygen that simply wasn't there. Then, at 6 p.m, well past the estimate for their air to run out, divers managed to find one of the missing connections and hooked up an airline. But for whatever reason, this didn't seem to work. 2,500 psi was being chucked down the airline, but no air was getting into the sub. Time ticked by. At 1 a.m, the entire pipe was removed as a last possible check, and was found to be full of ice. That explained the lack of airflow. Rather rapidly, the ice was cleared out, and the exhausted divers went down yet again. 35 hours after the submarine went down, and more than twice the time after which the air in the sub was supposed to have run out, fresh air was finally pumped into the submarine. It was only just in time, as many men had succumbed to near unconsciousness at this point, and virtually no one was capable of thinking straight long enough to do any significant work, and the work that was being done was taking 10 times as long as it would have done had they had clear heads. But now air poured into the sub, and the men revived rather quickly, and then once they were sure that they had enough oxygen, they began filling the compressed air bottles using the onboard compressor, and then blowing those into the ballast tanks. Tank after tank was fully blown, but the sub still refused to move. Only 2 small tanks were left, and hope appeared to be fading again, but then, as the valves opened to blow air into the penultimate tank, the bow slowly began to rise. The ships, with the wire looped around the bow, put in their own efforts to help as a froth of air on the surface clued everyone in as to what the sub was trying to do. The bow rose and rose until it was only 8 feet below the water, and then held there. A tube was fitted to the ammunition passage hatch on the outer hull to allow the passage of fresh water, food, and considerably more air via a considerably wider opening, but it took some hours to convey the message accurately enough through the hull for the men to understand what they needed to do. When they opened that hatch, a great waft of horrific black air burst out of the tube, leaving a small cloud over the assembled ships, and the drop in pressure within the sub tore at the crew's eardrums. But at last, supplies were reaching them, even if people on the surface, when leaning over the tube, quickly staggered away with their eyes watering as the air inside the sub was still utterly foul. The lower pressure did, however, accelerate the leaks through the bulkheads. The higher pressure within the sub had actually helped to push back slightly against that, and so it was decided to haul the bows out of the water to get the men out via the torpedo tubes before the flooding got too bad. Additional ships took the strain of the wire, and the sub was hauled further up. But then the sub started to slip backwards when the torpedo tubes were mostly, but not entirely, clear of the water, and efforts to haul them up had to be stopped again. An attempt was made now to cut a hole higher up in the sub's hull with an oxyacetylene torch. The first torch caught itself on fire. A new one was then sent for, but at that point the rumour from the sub of chlorine gas coming up almost prompted the men on the surface to try and haul the sub up the last few inches quickly and save as many as they could through the torpedo tubes before she slipped back into the water. Luckily, however, calmer heads on the sub prevailed, pointing out that the batteries were all in the aft section and completely flooded. There was nothing in the unflooded section of the submarine that could generate chlorine gas, and so everybody calmed down and new cutting gear arrived. At last, holes were cut down to the pressure hull and then through the pressure hull. It was now 3 in the morning, 2.5 days since the sub had slipped beneath the waves, and after 57 hours underwater, the last men managed to leave the sub, although a few of the larger ones had to be pulled through a slightly too small hole, as the hole had been cut in haste, rather than a slightly larger one, which would have taken more time. Indeed, by the time the last man left the sub with the rising tide in Garaloch, the water was a mere 3 inches away from this newly cut hole. Later in the day, a bulkhead aboard failed and the submarine sank back out of sight. Now, the mission was purely salvage. Divers went down to K-13 and found Goodhart's body still trapped in the wheelhouse. Most likely he'd been slammed into the roof of it with far too much force by the high-pressure air blast. Eventually, once the sub had been brought to the surface and the bodies recovered, it was found that faulty indicators had caused a ventilator valve to be left open. Modifications would have to be made to prevent this in future, and K-13 would, believe it or not, eventually be salvaged and returned to service as K-22. One Chief Petty Officer, Moth, who managed to lose his hair from the stress of this incident, found himself posted back aboard his old sub some months later. The issues with the K-class on their trials didn't stop there, though. K1 had so many minor faults that she took 5 months to complete her trials. K2 suffered an explosion and a fire from her electric motors after their insulation failed during her first dive, then nearly sank again when icy water partially froze the oil in the mechanisms that closed the hatches over the funnels. The fleet had to be ordered to use Arctic-rated oil in all systems from now on. K4 ran aground on Walney Island. K6 dove and refused to come up again until a dockyard worker found and repaired a fault in the air compressor. K14 sprang a leak at anchor when a ballast tank plate worked loose and flooded all the batteries, which also filled the sub with chlorine. K16's hydroplanes jammed while she was on a dive, and like K3, she nosedived straight into the seabed. Once the K-class were actually in service, still more problems arose. It became apparent that the bows of the subs were negatively buoyant, and that meant that at speed the sea would come in and batter the glass of the bridge, because the bow wouldn't ride over the waves and just simply smash straight through them. This is what had smashed the glass on K3. Thicker glass had been ordered fitted, but that didn't solve the underlying problem. Racing water over the bow also created a downwards pressure that would make the subs dive completely at random, which forced many submarines to run with their forward ballast tanks completely empty, forcing the bow to stay just above water. The sluicing water across the top of the hull also made it completely impossible to man the forward deck gun in anything other than a dead calm and low speed, and the churning water so battered the superstructure torpedo launchers that they were eventually ordered removed as they were constantly getting broken. Being somewhat narrow for their length, heading into anything other than a head sea would also tend to send the subs rolling when they were on the surface, which resulted in water pouring in via the conning tower and the funnels completely at random because it seemed the roll rate had no particular rhythm to it. They also had an alarming tendency to dive out of control. This was eventually found to be because of their great length, which gave their bows an inertia once they started heading down, which combined with the non-buoyant nature of the bow and a quirk of the design that meant that once the sub went past a given angle, the upper deck and superstructure tended to act like another giant hydroplane, thus giving the bow even more downforce. So it was all too easy to suddenly find the bow pointing down at increasingly steep angles until, like some kind of underwater dive bomber, the sub was plunging near vertically. The submarine's rated depth was 150 feet, which was much less than the total length of the hull, which averaged about 340 feet. As a result, captains became very picky about where they dived to ensure that in the event of a runaway descent, they would at least not go past crush depth before they hit the seabed. The fuel tanks caused problems as well. They were open to the sea at the bottom, as were a number of other submarine designs of this period and shortly thereafter. The idea was that as the fuel was drawn off from the top, because oil is lighter than water, seawater would naturally come in from the bottom, and thus the overall weight of the sub would remain relatively unchanged, as the fuel tanks would always be full of a liquid. But the rolling was so violent at times that this actually mixed the oil and the water in the fuel tanks into an emulsion that had enough water in it that when it was sprayed on the boiler fires, it put them out. This was nicknamed losing suction amongst the fleet and was a semi-permanent issue. K2 was almost crushed in one such runaway dive on an exercise with the Grand Fleet, saved only by a quick-thinking captain who blew every single ballast tank aboard and just about arrested her descent in water that at its base was 360 foot deep. When K11 had to make an emergency dive after the appearance of an unknown ship, the oil pump refused to turn off and a runaway oil spray set the boiler room on fire. Below 80 feet, it was also found the hydroplanes tended to jam, most likely due to the finer nature of the hull distorting just enough to cause the jams under pressure. But since the High Seas Fleet seemed somewhat disinclined to come out and fight the Grand Fleet, the K-class gradually filtered into service over 1917 and were sent paradoxically on anti-submarine patrol, something to which they were singularly unsuited. K7 turned out to be the only sub to find a target, firing a salvo at the U-95, of which one torpedo hit, but then failed to explode. The German sub tried to return the favour, but K7 used its speed to just leave before the U-boat could do all that much. And this came after K7 had to survive a depth charge attack by her own side, who once again thought that she was some kind of unusually large U-boat. During the same anti-sub operation, K1 ran aground. Later in the year, K4 ran into K1 whilst trying to avoid running into the 4th Light Cruiser Squadron. The damage done to K1 was bad enough that after a brief attempt to tow it, the light cruiser Blonde had to take off K1's crew and sink the sub with gunfire. In late 1917, the surviving subs were gradually brought back in to have large, flared, so-called swan bows fitted. This was to try and improve seaworthiness and give the bow a little bit of buoyancy. One of the deck guns was removed, and the other two guns were located higher up on the superstructure. Somewhat ironically, given that they were submarines, the K-class were now also fitted with depth charge launchers. K-13, now renamed K-22, did however manage to join the fleet without any major upsets, just in time for the K-class to be moved from Scapa Flow to Rosyth by Admiral Beatty, who was now in charge of the Grand Fleet. This was done over December 1917, and the submarines prepared themselves in their new home as best they could, although it was not an uncommon sight to see the stern of a K-class sub, screws thrashing vainly at thin air, propped up at an alarming angle from the water, before, with a blowing of ballast tanks, the bow would rise from the mud, and a slightly embarrassed crew brought their sub back onto a more even keel and headed off. Then Beatty's next orders came in. Operation EC-1 would see a full-scale fleet exercise involving ships from Scapa and Rosyth, including the two K-class flotillas. The fleet left on the night of the 31st of January 1918, with the primary formation consisting of HMS Courageous in the lead, followed by the cruiser Ithuriel and the 5 submarines of 13th Flotilla, all K-class, then 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron, then the cruiser Fearless and the 12th Flotilla, which was another 4 K-class, then 3 of the Queen Elizabeths, and their screening destroyers. Proceeding out at 16 knots at night, the line of vessels progressed east. At 0620, a mist descended and the forward submarine flotilla sped up to try and find Courageous, which had vanished into the murk. At 0706, Courageous passed May Island, with the small isle on her starboard side, and then she sped up, as a U-boat had been spotted the previous day in the area and the high-speed run was designed to throw off any chance the sub might have at catching the formation with torpedoes. Visibility was down to 1.5 miles or less and dropping fast. As Ithuriel passed May Island, K-14 saw first K-11 and then K-17 slow and haul out to port. Moments later, K-14 saw the problem. Minesweeping trawlers, completely unaware of the operation, had wandered across the formation's bows. K-14 also hauled out to port, but in the middle of the hard turn her steering jammed. She slowed down, checked for K-12 and K-22 coming up behind, and seeing that K-12 would pass well behind them, and K-22 should in theory be following K-12, K-14 slowed down, which freed up the rudder somehow, and thus began making her way back on a course to try and fall back into formation. But further behind, K-22 had in fact lost sight of K-14, and without any reference points, she had unknowingly drifted off course, now heading slightly more north than she was supposed to. And then suddenly, 200 yards ahead, a red navigation light sprang out of the gloom. Even a destroyer would have found it impossible to dodge, and the clumsy K-22, which of course had been formerly K-13, stood no chance of avoidance. The rudder was put over, but travelling at 19 knots, she hadn't even begun to swing about when her bow slammed into whatever it was that was in their way. The sub closed all watertight doors and began checking for internal damage, while some of the officers made their way forward to see what they'd struck. K-22's forward torpedo room was flooded, as was the compartment behind it, but the water had gotten no further. Recognising the outline of another K-boat, they assumed that they'd somehow overhauled and run into K-12. In fact, thanks to being off course, they'd run into K-14 just as she'd started freeing up her steering. K-14 almost had her bow cut off by the same collision. 2 men were killed instantly, and only a burst of superhuman strength from her first officer saved her as he wrenched a wooden door from the officers' quarters completely off its hinges in order to get it out of the path of a watertight door, which he then slammed shut. K-22 signalled the collision to Ithuriel and asked for some help. Although K-22 could probably make it back to harbour, K-14 was in a much worse state, and so K-22 manoeuvred itself to face the correct direction, as if she was still heading forward, which would hopefully mean the ships coming up from behind would see her main lights, which, like all of the ships, were shuttered to only cover a single point of the compass directly aft. This would obviously make it much harder to spot from the sides or ahead, which was a good anti-U-boat measure, but by having the light pointing directly aft, this would hopefully avoid any further collisions. K-12 had also avoided the trawlers and now took up station behind K-17, thinking that K-17 was in fact K-14, completely unaware of what had gone on behind them. K-14 and K-22 were now treated to the utterly terrifying sight of the 3 main members of the 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron flying past them at speed, along with a fan of destroyers in escort formation. Luckily, their distress signals were seen by the squadron flagship HMAS Australia, and she dispatched the destroyer Gabriel to assist. Indomitable managed to pass on by as well, but then, as a destroyer streaked past no more than 10 feet from the bow of K-22, the battlecruiser Inflexible came steaming out of the mist at 18 knots, heading straight for the subs. She tried to swing away, as did K-22, whose captain interspersed his orders with voluminous curses at the battlecruiser for not seeing the very light flares that they'd been launching for the past several minutes. And the minor course alterations made at least meant that instead of splitting K-22 in half, Inflexible merely smashed the forward 30 foot of the bow over at 90 degrees before scraping along the side of the submarine and stripping off every ballast and fuel tank that was mounted on that side. Somehow, after the prop washer died away, an extremely battered K-22 was still afloat. Inflexible steamed off into the night, apparently completely unheeding of the chaos she'd left in her wake. It was now 07:41. After some confusion decoding messages, by 0800 Ithuriel was aware of the first collision behind her, although K-22 still thought she'd hit K-12 instead of the sub she'd actually hit, but nonetheless Ithuriel wheeled back to help, with the 3 remaining K-boats of the flotilla dutifully following. She decided to take a wide turn to pass south of 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, which she was aware was coming up behind them, only to almost immediately run headlong into the Australia, as somehow the battlecruiser formation was now off course to the south by almost exactly the same amount that Ithuriel had allowed from the original course. Ithuriel dodged, the subs were far less agile, and now both sides just had to roll the collision dice and hope. If Australia changed course, her stern would swing out and would definitely hit one of the subs, and so she held her path, passing so close to K-12 that a man could have reached out and touched the racing battlecruiser. Up ahead, Ithuriel was now playing Dodge the Destroyer, with violent turns leaving the bewildered following subs to just work out their own salvation. For some reason, despite having been told to send a signal to the rest of the fleet as to what they were doing, Ithuriel's radio operator hadn't actually signalled their change of course yet, and wouldn't do for quite a while, so the first that anybody knew about it was when Australia radioed everyone to say that, well, she'd just seen the cruiser and 3 of the K-boats heading in completely the opposite direction. Fearless, leading the other 4 K-boats further aft, got this signal at about the same time they spotted the lights of the first flotilla with Ithuriel crossing their bow. Moving at 21 knots, Fearless slipped past Ithuriel and 2 of the K-boats, but this manoeuvre put her right in the path of K-17, or perhaps it put K-17 right in Fearless's path. Either way, the sub apparently didn't see the cruiser at all, or at least didn't see it until it was too late, and Fearless ran headlong into K-17 just forward of the conning tower. Somehow, as the sub sheared down the port side of the cruiser, no one aboard was killed by the collision. Water rushed in uncontrollably, the doors were closed, and the men all scrambled up onto the deck. The sub sank rapidly by the bow, dumping all of the crew into the water. Fearless's flotilla of subs, completely unaware of what was happening ahead, suddenly found themselves having to dodge each other as K4 slowed down and K3 narrowly avoided rear-ending her. K12, which was of course coming back, almost ran into K6, which was heading the other way. Unfortunately, whilst both subs managed to evade each other, this carried K6 into a collision with K4, which had stopped ahead of her. There was no time to do anything at all, and K6 almost cut K4 in half. This actually wedged the subs together for a moment before K4 began to sink like a stone, threatening to take K6 with her. The latter rapidly moved over to diving stations, and with her engines in full reverse, she managed to drag herself free before she was dragged under completely. Behind this, K7 saw Fearless and turned to port to avoid her. This found the sub now about to run down K6, which was stopped in the water just ahead. A last-minute turn and reversing the engine saw K7 just about scrape past K6, only to run straight over the already sinking K4. Fortunately, the cavalcade of collisions now came to an end, partially by judgment and a good way by luck, as the destroyer Venetia, leading the 5th Battle Squadron, managed to put a searchlight on K14, leading the Queen Elizabeths to give the first collision scene a wide berth. But Ithuriel's signals officer apparently only now woke up to what his job was and started transmitting the ship's intentions, which was a little bit late, and with a variety of submarines plus Fearless stopped, sinking, or just confused, The luck element came in as 5th Battle Squadron completely overran the second collision scene, missing K3 by mere inches. Unfortunately, luck was not so kind when it came to the destroyers who were escorting the battleships, one of whom sailed straight through most of K-17's survivors, the bloody aftermath leaving only 9 men alive in its wake, one of whom would die hours later. In the confusion, it took a while to figure out just who had hit who and which ships were missing. Eventually, it became clear that K4 had gone down with all hands, and Fearless was having to limp home backwards, escorted by K6 and K7. K22, despite being run down by a battlecruiser, managed to limp home by itself, whilst K14 was towed home by the Venetia. Thus ended what would become termed the Battle of May Island. Nor did the issues end there. In May 1918, K-15 was out on patrol when a heavy sea overwhelmed the funnels. Filling the boiler and engine rooms before anyone could do anything to stop it, K-15 sank stern first, but her new bow kept that end afloat, and the seabed turned out to be only 80 foot down, which left the sub with the bow in the air and the stern on the bottom. This was, however, the first time a K-class had dived uncontrollably by the stern, so new accomplishments and all that. It took 8 hours to get the submarine pumped out and refloated, since for some reason a large amount of cotton waste showed up and was clogging the bilge pumps, and they had to be repeatedly cleared by freezing cold diving crew. Still, they refloated her and she continued her patrol, bizarrely enough. Also in May, K3, with one Commander Shove in charge, decided it was just going to randomly dive, against its crew's wishes, whilst K3 was sailing over an underwater sinkhole in the Pentland Firth. The sub actually went down 266 feet, well below its test depth, and the pressure buckled and distorted almost every part of the submarine, but by some miracle she didn't crush. The somewhat battered vessel then managed to resurface and limp back to port, with Commander Shove and his pet white rat, which lived in his pocket, safely making it ashore. Speaking of ashore, the Admiralty, however, seemed to think that these incidents could just be ignored, and instead more and larger subs were under consideration. K-18, K-19, K-20 and K-21, just ordered, were reordered to a modified design that, to be fair, ditched the steam plant for a more conventional diesel plant, but then mounted a 12-inch gun forward instead. These were then redesignated M1 through M4. Oddly enough, despite the massive weight of a battleship cannon up front, the M-class were much better handling than the Ks. Not that this was an especially high bar to clear, to be fair. M4 was actually cancelled due to the end of the war, and the progress of the M-class is a completely different matter for another day. K-23 through K-28 were also ordered toward the end of the war to a modified design, although with the end of the conflict, all but K-26, the most advanced of the set, were cancelled. Thus, in the post-war environment, the K-class fleet consisted of the wartime survivors, plus K-26, but this fleet rapidly diminished. K-3 was moved to reserve and quickly scrapped after her high-pressure crushing encounter, and K-7 was put up for sale around the same time. The remaining submarines were divided up amongst the 1st Submarine Flotilla, which was charged with gaining experience in all-weather oceanic work with large submarines, whilst the other 5 left over from this would be used as experimental craft to test new technologies. During this period, K-15 had 2 out-of-control dives, K-8 caught fire, K-14 suffered a boiler explosion and then a battery explosion on her next voyage after she'd been repaired. Oddly, the Ks managed to pass through summer 1919 all the way through to summer 1920 without any major incidents, despite a lot of sailing, albeit they did lawn dart into the seabed at a disturbingly regular set of intervals. This streak came to an end when K5 dived into the seabed in Largo Bay and then had to extract herself, followed by a minor collision with a destroyer which was itself under tow for scrapping. By the end of the year, K2, K10 and K20 had also been earmarked for disposal. K5 was refitted, and with a mostly new crew, she sailed out to an exercise in January 1921 along with K8, K9, K15 and K22. At the start of the exercise, they were supposed to practice their fleet attack role, steaming ahead of the fleet, which was done without much issue. Then they were to dive under a cruiser screen, and then pop up to periscope depth to engage the battleships, much as they would do in an actual fleet action. K9 had trouble diving. After a while, with all of the ballast tanks full, it was realised that the safety valves on the Swan bow had been left shut when the submarine left harbour, which was then holding the sub on the surface like a giant life preserver. However, K-22 decided that it was going to try and lawn dart into the seabed again, on the opposite end of the spectrum, and her experienced commander immediately blew all the tanks to get her back to the surface, even if this meant failing his attack run as he popped up in the middle of the cruisers. K9, incidentally, had actually managed to release the safety valves on her Swan bow, dive, and commence a proper attack run. As the scattered subs regrouped, it was realised, though, that K5 was nowhere to be seen. The exercise was paused and a large-scale search was ordered. Eventually, some oil and wreckage showed up. It seemed that K5 had also dived out of control, but her new crew were not quick enough to respond, and she'd passed through her crush depth and imploded. Her loss, with all hands, brought K2 a reprieve from scrapping briefly as a replacement in First Submarine Flotilla, but in summer K15 sank in Portsmouth whilst moored, as temperature changes led to her hydraulic fluid contracting, which opened up vents, which then caused her to take on water and sink. She was, however, successfully salvaged in a couple of weeks, but subsequently sold to the breakers. At least she'd sunk without any loss of life. K-26, the modified sub, proved a significant improvement. She had 6 21-inch torpedo tubes in her bow instead of 4 18-inch, which made her a little bit longer. Her superstructure was altered, which almost entirely eliminated all cases of water getting into the funnels. She had 50% more fuel, which gave her more range. She had better ballast tanks and better batteries, which improved her dive time and her endurance underwater, and her hull was built stronger, adding about 100 foot to her test depth. She, and all surviving K-class, were also fitted with a new rapid blow system, which was installed in the forward tanks to save the craft from unexpected out-of-control dives. K-22 demonstrated the wisdom of this when she dived with her funnels still open, the new system managing to recover her back to the surface before the boiler room had completely flooded and she repeated the Garalock debacle in much deeper water. But by 1926, the last of the original K-class was sold for scrap, thus leaving, ironically enough, K-26 as the only survivor. She, however, remained in service for the rest of the decade, performing somewhat better than her predecessors, but at 2,140 tons surface displacement, it turned out she was just too large for the limits that were imposed on subs by the London Naval Treaty, and so she was sold for scrap in the Mediterranean in 1931. With her passed the last steam-powered submarine until the launch of USS Nautilus at the start of the Cold War, albeit Nautilus was powered by a nuclear reactor, not an oil-fired boiler. The K's legacy, such as it was to spark an interest across the world in the fleet or cruiser submarine, something that until their full reveal after the war, only the US had been really considering. Ironically, the German threat that they'd been built to counter had never actually existed, and never would exist whilst the UK and Germany remained on opposite sides. And so ended the story of one of the greatest examples of looks good on paper, possibly a good idea for the first 5 minutes of their lives, but practically quite terrible a thing in execution.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.